if this snake, a Liberia, gives you a full dose, you will very unlikely to survive. But it's very unusual that it does that. It usually either doesn't inject anything or just a small amount. Anyway, the best trick with snakes is to stay away from them.
Hello, my name is Thea Darracott, and I am the Acting Executive Retail Editor and Events Director for Condé Nast Traveller. Some of you may already be familiar with our live Traveller's Tales series, which we host in London. While during this period of lockdown, we'll be hosting them as a series of recorded Zoom conversations. And I'm very excited to be joined now by Leo Houlding. Leo Houlding is one of Britain's top climbers and among the best in the world. He is a veteran of a score of epic ascents, including Everest, but specialises in free climbing the most technical peaks and biggest walls in the world. And at the end of last year, he and his team bashed through 100 kilometres of Amazon jungle past venomous snakes to free climb Mount Roraima. Leo, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure. Sorry about the screaming kids downstairs.
I think that's everyone right now. I just wanted to start by asking you when your passion for climbing began.
Well, I was fortunate to grow up not far from where I live right now in the Lake District in the northwest of England. And my dad was always a very passionate outdoorsman, a hill walker and a scrambler, but never a technical rock climber. And it was a friend of his that introduced he and I to climbing together. And that was, I guess, when I discovered my passion as a 10-year-old boy. I was always super passionate about playing outside and climbing trees and all those other countryside boy things. But when I got the chance to get on vertical rock faces, I feel very fortunate that I did discover something I was truly passionate about so early in life.
And there were so many different forms of climbing available to you. You specialise in free climbing. What was it about free climbing that you like?
Well, that's a good point. The climbing is a very broad church and becoming broader every year. Free climbing is not what most people think. Free climbing is climbing. It's where you use your hands and your feet to climb a cliff. You still use ropes as opposed to free soloing, which is what people assume free climbing is when you climb with no ropes at all. There's another type of climbing which is called aid climbing, where you use climbing hardware, carabiners, ropes, all the jangly bits to assist your way up the cliff. So free climbing is basically what you think of when you think of climbing, whether that be at a climbing wall or on a cliff or on a big mountain. So yeah, it's definitely free climbing is what I'm passionate about. But within that kind of genre, it's still a broad church. From most people these days will associate climbing with indoor climbing walls. In London alone, there's about 30 indoor walls. Most of them are bouldering walls, so you never go very far off the ground, and it's all about physical performance with no or very limited risk. But for me, the adventurous side to climbing, the element of risk, and it is that's really what I've devoted my life to. And the super adventurous end of the spectrum is what I specialize in. These giant cliffs that we call big walls, the tallest cliffs in the world, which often tend to be in extremely remote places that are very difficult to get to. And that's what I really love. It's, I do like bouldering. I like climbing. I like climbing indoors. I like sport climbing, the safe, amenable aspects to the sport. But definitely what I'm most passionate about is these wild, wild places where, very few people even know these places exist, let alone see them or get to spend weeks and months immersed in these incredible landscapes, be it most recently in the depths of the Amazon rainforest or in the wildest places in Antarctica or in high Himalayas. It's just amazing to go to these places and do pretty extreme stuff in these wild landscapes.
So how do you find them?
A lot of these places are known in the climbing community. Everybody knows about Mount Everest, of course, and places like the Yosemite Valley in California, that's widely known. A lot of them are national parks. It's just so happens that a lot of the world's best climbing areas are in areas of outstanding natural beauty. Here in the UK, the best climbing areas are Snowdonia, the Lake District, the Peak District, and up in Scotland, Pembroke. They're all national parks. So I guess those landscapes that people find beautiful are often very craggy places where there's good climbing. And it's the same internationally. But then the more obscure places like Baffin Island in northeast Canada, northeast Greenland, Antarctica, Queen Maudland, even Patagonia, the Cerro Torre Fitzroy, these are quite well known in the climbing world. But outside of that, they're just so remote and obscure that unless you know about them, you kind of don't. And then some places, not even climbers know about them. But I suppose there's a pool of knowledge that we share to a certain extent. But some of these places, which hopefully I'll send you some pictures and you can intercut them, they're like something out of Lord of the Rings. You know, there are real places in the world which are just utterly mind-blowing. They look like landscapes from Middle Earth, and they're there, and some people don't even know they exist.
So how do you find them? I mean, in my mind now, I've got this vision of these tales of these remote mountains being told over campfires by elite climbers. How do you discover these very remote places?
Well, that is what it was like traditionally, but obviously in the modern age, everybody's on Instagram, right? And the social media is a way. It's all there if you know where to look. And even the more obscure places are quite well known. One mountain in particular, which is beyond obscure, was a big expedition I did 2 years ago to a mountain called the Spectre in the Transantarctic Mountains in Antarctica near the South Pole. And that is the end of the world. And that one was really, very few people know about it.
Well, you were only the third person to ever climb it, is that right? And the first
yes,
people who climbed it found it.
Kind of. They named it. It was discovered in the 30s by an expedition, but you know, more remarkable than that is that less than a dozen people have ever even seen the mountain, let alone climbed it. It's really the end of the world. The Transantarctic Mountains is the end of the world. Nobody ever goes there. The only expeditions which have ever explored that region are scientific expeditions backed normally by the US government, multi-million-dollar exploits with the United States Air Force in support, you know, huge operations. The Transantarctic Mountains is 4 times the size of the Alps, and we were the first independent climbing expedition ever to explore the region. There's been a few ski traverses that have gone through this mountain range on big crossings, but no one's ever been there to go climbing without government support. So that was a real privilege, a hugely expensive, complicated expedition. We kite skied for 2,000 kilometers across the continent with 70 days worth of food and climbed this mountain. And, you know, the mountains that I specialize in, they're not big snowy peaks like Mont Blanc. They're big fangs that look like, you know, shark's teeth. And the Spectre is just like that. It's a huge chunk of granite, not dissimilar to the Shard in London, but almost 3 times the size. And that kind of architecture, the big pointy thing, which obviously means it's very difficult to climb. The difficulty of a mountain is directly proportional to the angle. And so climbing a mountain like that in a region like that is, you know, another worldly experience, but also something I've learned. You know, I'm 40 in a couple of weeks, and I've been doing this pretty much full time for my entire adult life. It very much is the process, not the destination. Although clearly we were there to climb this mountain and get to the top, just standing at the bottom of such a beautiful and obscure landscape is a real privilege. And spending time there, you know, as I said, a lot of these places are national parks, but often if you don't have a reason to spend time there, you just go and look at it, you take a picture, you put it on Instagram, tick, gone. And that's still cool. But, you know, for example, the Yosemite Valley in California, I've literally spent years of my life in that valley. Most people will go for a day or 2 max, and to spend these extended periods, weeks and months in these landscapes, you get to know it a bit more, you get beneath the surface, and it's wonderful.
So tell me a bit more about Spectre. You kite skied there, which, I mean, I have no idea how do you control the speed when you're kite skiing?
Well, kite skiing is very similar to kite surfing. Most people will have seen that at some point on the TV or whatever. So you have these huge kites with long lines, and obviously kite skiing, you're doing it on skis. On the long distance journeys, you drag behind you a large sledge. We call it a pulk. Our pulks were over 200 kilos when we set off on that journey. but the kites aren't like the kites you had when you were a kid. You know, they're essentially, they're very, very similar to paragliders. They're twin skinned ram air wings, they're called, foil kites, and they're quite sophisticated. You know, they cost like £3,000 each, and they have clever braking systems. It's been around for about 20 years, but in the last kind of 5 years, the technology's really come of age. So they're very controllable. They're very safe. Well, relatively safe. It's all, you know, it's all on the spectrum. But you use different sizes of kite for different wind conditions. On that expedition, we had 3 sizes of kite ranging from 9 square meters, which is about the size of a double bed sheet, through to 18 square meters, which is obviously twice that size. But they've got some serious power. When you drop them into the power zone, you kind of always moving the kite. If you keep it high and to the side, there's less power. If you drop it through the kind of cone in front of you, there's more power. And you change kites depending on the wind. It was a windy trip, so we were, and when you have a huge load like that, you need to be overpowered. But they're impressive things. The only thing I could compare it to is it's kind of like a motorbike. You know, if you sit on a motorbike and you accelerate, you have this immense amount of power at your fingertips. They're quite something. The top speed we clocked on the trip, we had a GPS tracking device the whole time for navigation, so we know exactly what it was, and it was over 60 kilometers an hour. You know, that's like 43 miles per hour, which is really very, very fast to be traveling in a super remote place across the ice with a huge load behind you. I mean, that's too fast. That was the top speed, but we were cruising at 25, 30 miles an hour for, you know, days at a time. It was incredible. We had a couple of days towards the end of the trip when it really was perfect conditions, powder snow underneath our feet, cruising at 25 miles an hour, covering over 200 kilometers a day. And it was like something out of a dream. But that came right at the end. The first good day of kiting was day 42 of the expedition. The first month and a half were brutal conditions in minus 30 with super strong wind and bad surface. It's called sastrugi, these big ridges of ice. It was a hard trip.
And there were hidden crevasses, is that correct, on your way?
Yeah, at one point in the journey. Most of the time when we were traveling, we were up on the high Antarctic plateau, which is fairly crevasse free. There are some big crevasse fields that you know about, that you can see them on Google Earth and navigate around them. But where the mountain is, we dropped down off the ice cap onto a big glacier called the Scott Glacier, and that was heavily crevassed. And you could see them, but we were traveling at pace with kites and kiting across them. They tend to be filled with snow. And then right as we approached the mountain, like literally the last kilometer of a 400-kilometer journey, we slowed down because you could see the peak for the first time. And a tiny little crevasse, one of the small ones, my pulk, which was weighed 200 kilos, broke the snow bridge and fell through into the crevasse and started, well, very violently ejected me backwards into it. It was quite a close call. But thankfully, the rope that attaches you to the sledge, we put knots in it for that precise reason, in case that happens. And the knot wedged into the side of the crevasse, and it worked and stopped me being pulled into it.
And you were not alone. So tell me about how you choose your team. Do you work with the same people, or does it vary from expedition to expedition?
It varies somewhat. I did a bunch of large expeditions with the same crew. For about 10 years ago, we did half a dozen major trips. Essentially, a team of friends with similar desires and skills. That Spectre expedition was a bit different because it wasn't a pure climbing expedition. There's not very many people in the world that have the skills for a long distance polar kiting trip with a highly technical alpine summit in the middle. So I actually went out looking for my partners for that trip, and the two guys I found, Jean Bergen, a Frenchman, and Mark Seddon, a Kiwi, I didn't really know them before that trip. I intentionally looked for people with that skill set that would be fun to spend, nearly 3 months in a remote tent with, and also that have a lifestyle that enables you to do an expedition of that duration. Not many people can take 3 months out of life, from family, from work, from commitments, to go and do something which is unpaid and really quite dangerous. So finding someone with the skills and the lifestyle was not simple, but in the end, I couldn't have found two better partners. We had an absolutely amazing experience. They were the best people in the world to do that trip with. We had a right laugh. We made a film, and you can see that amongst the hardship, there's a lot of joy and laughter. But then for other trips, it's different. It depends. Basically, I tend to do it with people that I know, with my friends. The most recent expedition to the Amazon rainforest, to this other dreamscape called Mount Roraima in Guyana, was with a couple of friends from the UK and a couple of friends from the States, basically.
So that was very different, of course, being in thick jungle. And tell me about how you managed to drop off your food as well. You had to drop off supplies before you got there.
It couldn't be more different to the spectre in Antarctica. Antarctica is a completely sterile, lifeless environment. Like literally nothing lives there, even the smallest moss or lichen. It's too cold and too hostile. It's also very monochrome. Everything is white or blue or black. It's just ice and snow and the occasional rock in the mountains. Whereas the Amazon rainforest is obviously the most rich, biodiverse, life-filled environment on the planet, bar none. 50% of the world's species live in rainforests. And this mountain, Mount Roraima, sits right on the very northern fringe of the Amazon basin. So it's just full of color and biodiversity, greens and reds and blues, and all kinds of bird life and insects. There are large mammals. You tend not to see large mammals unless you go looking for them, because we're a noisy team. But the insects and the sounds of the insects, especially at night, it's like a concert hall. These cicadas and bats and all kinds of things. So I really, really enjoy that contrast. I don't prefer one environment over the other. I love the fact that 2 years ago we were in the wastelands of Antarctica. 2 years later we were in the Amazon, with essentially the same purpose, to go and climb an extremely challenging remote peak. Roraima is it's where The Lost Worlds is set. Arthur Conan Doyle's famous book is based on that mountain. And more recently, the Disney Pixar movie Up, which you've probably seen. I see you've got a young daughter there. That's Mount Roraima, and that's exactly what it looks like. This 2,000 foot high plateau, like Table Mountain in Cape Town. It's a flat topped mountain, but it protrudes out the Amazon jungle below for almost 7,000 feet, the last 2,000 feet being completely overhanging. It looks like the bow of the Titanic sticking up out the jungle, but 100 times bigger. So yeah, but it's almost 60, well, it's a 100-kilometer hike from the closest Indian community, Amerindian village. So moving the quantities of equipment that you need to climb a cliff like that, and the food that you need for a team of 6 to survive for a month is, it's vast. It's at least 600 kilos of stuff. So what we did was we airdropped it all in. The only way of getting to this village called Philippi is by a bush plane. So you fly from the capital, Georgetown, into this little grass airstrip in this Indian community. And it's only about 20 minutes detour in a plane to go via the mountain. So we went on a slight detour, and with a homemade parachute system, which I designed and had a friend build, we threw out 4 parachute loads, 500 kilos of equipment,
and I think you
down
should
into the jungle.
Tell us why you needed to make these parachutes special. What was different about them?
Parachute drop sounds so simple, but in civilian life, it's very rare. It never happens, basically, occasionally in disaster zones. But dropping a load into a jungle, obviously it's all trees. The trees are very tall. So if you just threw out a parachute with a bag attached to it, almost certainly it's going to get tangled and stuck at the top of the trees. I am a skydiver. I've done a lot of base jumping. I know quite a lot about parachutes. I also made friends with some people in the British military who have a system for dropping into jungle. So basically, instead of suspending the load directly underneath the parachute, you hang it 60 meters below on a rope, so that the load comes crashing through the trees and lands on the ground before the parachute gets tangled in the trees. Then we also had a really ingenious tracking device from it's a radio transmitter, shortwave radio transmitter, which gives out a frequency you can pick up over a normal VHF radio. It's kind of similar to an avalanche transceiver type technology, because we had to find these bags almost a week in the jungle. Yeah, and in the jungle you can't, you could be 3 meters away from something and not know it was there. So we had this little device with a loud beeper, a strobe light, and this radio transmitter, which worked a treat. So
you found
we were able to find, which is fortunate, because the whole success of the expedition, I mean, if we hadn't found the stuff, there's no way we would have got up the mountain. So we carried enough food in to be able to get out again if we didn't find the stuff. But we found it, and I actually spent 42 days straight in the deep jungle climbing this mountain, and another one immediately afterwards, which is a long time to be in that environment. It's very wet, it's muddy, it rained every day. But we had what we needed. We knew what to do with it, and we had a great time.
What about wildlife training? Do you need to have any first aid training particular to the animals that you'll be surrounded by?
First aid training, definitely some basic training. Myself, one of the other guys, have a decent level of basic training. My wife's a GP, so the most important thing for remote medicine is communication. So a satellite phone, 2 satellite phones, because you need to make sure you've got communication if one fails, and having someone on standby 24/7 who you can speak to. That, and a really well-spec'd, I mean, first aid kit's not really the right term. First aid is one thing, but medical response is another. It's not just injuries and first aid. You need to be able to manage intestinal infections, and so you need loads of antibiotics, and you need someone who knows what to do with them, really a doctor. So we had a hefty first aid kit spec'd by my wife. With regards to wildlife, the only thing you really need to watch out for is snakes, and there are deadly venomous snakes in that region. We actually had quite a close call with one. It's called a Labaria. It's the most deadly snake in the Amazon, and you don't generally take antivenom on expeditions, because there's loads of different kinds of snakes which require different antivenoms. Traditionally, it always had to be kept refrigerated.
Yeah.
Now there are types that you don't have to refrigerate, but antivenom is extremely potent, dangerous stuff. You really need it to be administered in a hospital environment by trained professionals. You can kill someone with antivenom, and often with snake bites, it's more often than not, it's what they call a dry bite. It's unusual for a snake to inject all its venom into you, because it knows it can't eat you, and it takes a long time for the snake to produce its venom. So more often than not, it's either no venom or just a small amount to scare you off. If this snake, a Liberia, gives you a full dose, you will very unlikely to survive. But it's very unusual that it does that. It usually either doesn't inject anything or just a small amount. Anyway, the best trick with snakes is to stay away from them. We also had a team of locals from the village, the Amerindian guys. They're called the Akawayo people. And it's great because Guyana is the only English-speaking country in South America. So these full-scale Indians who live in the jungle, they hunt with bow and arrows. They live off pretty much subsistence way out there. No communications. They don't even have a VHF radio in the village. No way of contacting this place. But they all speak like Creole Caribbean English, so they all talk like Bob Marley. And so you can communicate easily with these guys. They all talk like this, man. Yeah, we're going to go out kill a tip, yeah. And they were really good fun, and it was really nice being able to communicate so openly with these people from such a different walk of life. And they understand the forest, like they live there, so they have snake eyes. They just spot things that, everything's camouflaged, and they would just spot something. Oh, check that out! What? Oh, wow! Yeah, there's a spider the size of a dinner plate, which we saw on the way in, and they were so generally when we were with them, we'd let them check the trail ahead and the camp, and they did most of the machete work as well. Machetes are the most dangerous thing in the jungle. People love to white boy flailing around with his machete, and they're so dangerous to either hit someone behind you or. I've done a few expeditions, and the only injuries I've ever seen have been self-inflicted machete wounds. But these guys that we went out with, we had about 10 of them came in with us to help cut the trail and porter some of the loads. 2 of them, Edward and Troy, we trained up on how to climb ropes, and they came up the cliff with us.
No,
they spent
that's
2 weeks.
amazing.
We brought an extra set of equipment because I thought it'd be really cool to bring some locals with us. I've done a couple of things in Guyana before. I know they speak English. I know these Amerindians. They're super fit. Edward's 56 years old, and he looks like a boxer, just completely ripped. And they climb trees, and they're really good with their hands. And I figured that we'd be able to train them, in like a day in the rope climbing techniques. And I thought we might find a couple that were up for it. And sure enough, of the 10 guys with us, only 2 of them wanted to join us, and they did, and they climbed up the wall, and it was kind of a big deal in Guyana. Roraima is an iconic, it's famous in Guyana, and they were the first Guyanese and First Nations people, they're Indians, and so it was kind of we did a big press conference when we got back to Georgetown, and they were in the newspapers and stuff. It was really cool.
But it wasn't just any route, was it? Didn't you plotted a new route up the mountain that people hadn't taken before?
Yes, we did. It's been climbed a handful of times, and we climbed right up the front of the prow, right up the bow of the ship, as it were, which was just the most strikingly beautiful line. Aesthetics are kind of weirdly important in climbing there. For me, at least, these mountains, which you're going to be seeing intercut in this, are beautiful things. And the line that you choose is kind of fundamental to the climb. It's really nice to choose a route, a line, which you don't have to be a climber to see. For example, on Mount Roraima, it's the bow of the ship. You go straight up the edge. And that's quite important to me, the aesthetics of where you are. What was utterly remarkable on that climb is almost exactly halfway up an overhanging cliff. So you're constantly hanging in your harness or climbing. There was a ledge about 1 meter wide and about 10 meters long, halfway up, right on the edge, looking out over this vast expanse of rainforest. Nothing except rainforest as far as you can see in 270-degree perspective, because we were right on the edge of the ship. And it was just incredible. That's where we had our wall camp, and we spent 5 nights up there with a big team, 8 people, which is massive. You never climb a big wall with a team of 8. The logistics of, all the water you've got to bring, all the food, it's really complicated. But I'm very experienced. A couple of the other guys, Waldo and Wilson, are, and we were able to share this incredible journey up this giant cliff. There was a young woman from close to here in the Lake District who's a really good climber, but she'd never been on a major trip before. We've been climbing together a bit around here, so she joined us as well and took a leading role on some of the hard climbing. So it was awesome having 8 people up on this incredible ledge watching the sunrise. It's one of my favorite parts is the quite literally the hanging out that you do in these places.
Incredible. And then my final question to you is, what are you up to next? When everything is lifted and you get on a plane again, where are you going to go?
Well, that's a good question. I'm supposed to be in Pakistan right now. I had an expedition planned to a mountain called Trango Tower. So I'm not sure. Maybe Pakistan next summer. I'm hoping to do something prior to that. But to be honest, the Lake District, the weather's been amazing for the last few weeks. I've got a little boy and a little girl, 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I've been introducing them to. We did our first multi-pitch climb the other day. That's when you tie yourself to the cliff and you cruise your way up. So the 4 of us, my wife and 2 little kids, did a 3-pitch route here in the Lake District, and that was a wonderful adventure. So they're taking me to it. You're a good
teacher. They couldn't be in safer hands.
Well, as a parent, you don't want to push too hard because you don't want them to rebel against it and force them to do something they're not into. But at the same time, you want to give them the opportunity to develop the skills early. And I'm not bothered about whether they become climbers or not, but I would like them to have a to share my passion for the natural world and for adventure in an outdoor environment.
Well, I'm sure it's contagious. I can't see how they wouldn't. Thank you so much for joining me, Leo.
No problem. Thanks for having me, and I hope you enjoy the pretty pictures too.
Thank you.